Hi everyone, so in this video we're going to be looking at murmurs. So previously we spoke about normal auscultation, normal heart sounds, S1, S2, and then in the following video we spoke about abnormal heart sounds. We looked at loudness, we looked at splitting, we looked at extra sounds like S3 and S4, but now we're going to be looking at murmurs. So what is the definition of a murmur? A murmur is basically a continuous abnormal sound. So that's different from S3 and S4, which is a single sound, like da 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 da, single sounds, whereas murmurs are continuous sounds. Okay, so for example, you could have a sound like sh sh sh. So if we have S1 and S2, you could have a continuous sound between them. So it would be sh sh sh. So there's like a continuous sound, and this would be a systolic sound because S1 is the start of systole, as we mentioned previously. So you get two different types of murmurs. You get what is called the systolic murmur, and then you get a diastolic murmur. And as the name implies, systolic murmurs are murmurs which occur during systole, and the diastolic murmurs are those which occur during diastole. So if we draw the normal cardiac cycle, we have S1 and S2. A murmur that occurs between S1 and S2 would be systolic, and a murmur that occurs after S2 and before the next S1, okay, is going to be diastolic. Okay, so if we were to highlight it like that, systolic is red and diastolic is going to be blue, anything between S2 and the following S1. Okay. Now, you get different types of systolic murmurs. So you get an early systolic murmur and you get a pansystolic murmur. So early systolic is the early systole, okay? So for example, it might be like that, okay? So early systole, or you get a pansystolic murmur, which is the entire systole, okay? And then you can get an early diastolic, so it would be something like that. So only the early part of diastole, or you could get a mid-diastolic murmur. Okay, so all we're doing is that we're just describing where the murmur is taking place, or when the murmur is taking place. And you can see that for the systolic murmurs and the diastolic murmurs, there are different causes. And you can obviously memorize these different causes, but I'm going to teach you an approach to actually understand why these murmurs occur at those particular times. So the golden rule is, if the blood is going up, it's systolic. That's sort of the golden rule that I think is very useful. And if the blood is going down, it's diastolic. And I'm going to explain that for each of these pathologies. So for example, with aortic stenosis, we know that the aorta is actually stenosed. The blood is going up, and there's a narrowing of the aortic artery. And because the blood is going up, it's going to be a systolic murmur. So we said systolic murmur is when the blood is going up, okay? And the same with pulmonary stenosis. The pulmonary artery is narrowed, blood is going up across the pulmonary artery, and therefore that's going to be a systolic murmur, okay? And then what about the pansystolics? Mitral regurg, tricuspid regurg. Mitral regurg, what's happening? Remember, the blood usually goes from the left atrium to the left ventricle, and then from the left ventricle to the aorta. But if the mitral valve is incompetent, blood is going to go back up from the left ventricle to the left atrium. So blood is going up, so it's a systolic murmur. Mitral regurg is systolic. What about tricuspid regurg? The same thing. Blood usually goes from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery, but if the tricuspid valve is incompetent, the blood will go back into the right atrium. Blood is going up, and if the blood is going up, it's systolic murmur. Okay, let's look at the diastolic murmur, mitral stenosis. What's mitral stenosis? That's when the mitral valve is stenosed. It's narrowed. And what's happening to the blood? It's going down. It's going down, so it's a diastolic murmur, so it fits the rule there. What about tricuspid stenosis? That's when the tricuspid valve is stenosed, and the blood is going down from the right atrium to the right ventricle, so therefore it's going to be a diastolic murmur. What about early diastolic, so aortic regurg and pulmonary regurg? Aortic regurg is when the aortic valve is incompetent, so blood goes out of the normal aorta, but because the aortic valve doesn't close properly, the blood comes back down, And when blood goes down, it's diastolic, which is why aortic regurg is diastolic. And pulmonary regurg, the pulmonary valve is incompetent, so usually blood goes out of the pulmonary artery to the lungs. But in this case, the pulmonary valve is incompetent, doesn't close properly, so the blood comes back down. And because it's coming down, it's going to be a diastolic murmur. So that's a nice, easy way to remember it. Whenever you're confronted with a disease like mitral stenosis, okay, I think to myself, the blood is going down because the mitral valve is stenosed, blood is going down. So because it's going down, it must be a diastolic murmur. So I find this is a very helpful way to think of murmurs. So just in summary, we've spoken about the normal heart sounds, S1 and S2. We've spoken about how you have to actually time them with the carotid because S1 corresponds to the pulse, systole. So if you feel a pulse and you hear a sound, that sound is S1. Okay? And then we spoke about abnormal heart sounds, the loudness, the splitting, and the S3 and the S4. But in this video, we spoke about the continuous sounds which can be made, which are called murmurs. I haven't gone into why mitral stenosis is mid and aortic regurg is early. I think the most important thing is to recognize a systolic murmur versus a diastolic murmur. But just so that you are aware that these have different characters. So for example, mitral stenosis is mid-diastolic. So you would hear S1, S2, pause, and then the murmur. So do-do-ch, 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 do-do-ch. With mitral stenosis. With aortic stenosis, it's going to be early systolic, so ch, ch, do, ch, do, ch, do. Mitral regurg is pansystolic, so ch, ch, the whole of systole. You're hearing ch, ch. Okay, so I hope that this makes sense. What about aortic regurg? Ch, ch, because remember it's early diastolic. To, ch, to. So that's kind of what you would hear. So I recommend that you go onto YouTube and you watch different videos, but I hope that you understand why the murmurs take place where they do, and I hope that you found this video helpful.